extreme view. By then, even members of Congress who had previously supported the program believed that it was best left in the past, but not our nominee to head the CIA. Now we come to his hearing, when he emphasized his commitment to the 2015 law that limits interrogation techniques to those authorized by the Army Field Manual. That sounded pretty good, but a review of his responses to the committee's questions revealed more troubling views. For example, he was asked about his statements in 2014 and whether he believed the CIA's interrogation program should be resumed. He responded that he would have consultations about whether there should be changes to current interrogation or detention programs involving the CIA. So, understand the implications of that. He was asked, should the program, this interrogation program, be resumed, and he was going to have consultations about whether there ought to be changes in it. Now, with respect to the Army Field Manual, he wrote that these consultations, including with experts at the agency on whether the field manual uniform application is an impediment to gathering vital intelligence to protect the country, or whether any rewrite of the Army Field Manual is needed, certainly suggests again that there are open questions with respect to the Field Manual and torture. The fact is, the Army Field Manual could be improved to further clarify, in my view, that the United States government should rely on non-coercive techniques that are the most effective. And the statute states clearly that revisions to the Army Field Manual cannot involve the use of threat or force. But given the Congressman's statements in support of torture, it is not clear that is what he has on his mind. Consistently on this issue, there is a difference between what he says and the fine print when he is required to state his views about interrogation in writing. Moreover, the nominee is not just talking about changes in the Army Field Manual. He's expressing openness to ditching the whole thing, at least as far as the CIA is concerned. The fundamental premise of the McCain-Feinstein legislation in 2015 was that the Army Field Manual would apply uniformly across the U.S. government, including the Department of Defense and the CIA. So while he may have testified that McCain-Feinstein is the law, he plans on questioning whether the whole thing ought to be tossed out. And who are the experts at the agency he wants to ask? There's certainly CIA officers who understand the importance of uniform standards and recognize the effectiveness of non-coercive interrogation techniques. But if he's talking about going back to individuals associated with the CIA's torture program, and everybody ought to be pretty apprehensive about what he's going to hear. In other words, reading the nominee's response to written questions is very different than resuming the CIA's interrogation program and questions about whether the Army Field Manual should apply to the CIA. And I come back to that point, Mr. President. The nominee is a very skilled lawyer, and he has been involved in intelligence for quite some time. But I have been concerned that he has consistently said things that are different than his written responses with respect to this issue. And part of what concerns me about all this hedging is that the congressman doesn't seem familiar with the broad consensus that torture, in addition to being contrary to our values, does not work. This is what was documented extensively in the Intelligence Committee's torture report, not just the 500-page summary, but the 6,700-page full report. But there's a growing body of additional evidence. For example, the role of interrogating high-level terrorist suspects has been given in recent years to the high-value detainee interrogation program, which does not torture. The congressman was asked whether he believed this program was effective, a topic with which he should be familiar as a member of the committee. He said he hadn't studied the question. He was asked about their report last year that detailed how non-coercive interrogation techniques are more effective. He refused to give an opinion on this as well. All of this is problematic because, as in the case of surveillance, the congressman has not considered whether we can do without highly problematic programs at no cost to our security. Just as we have security and liberty, we can have smart security policies that maintain our national values. Now, his troubling views on torture were most apparent in the inflammatory statements made in December 2014 when the Intelligence Committee released the torture report. The nominee referred to criticism of the CIA torture program as a liberal game, as this view hadn't also been expressed by some of the most conservative members of Congress and dozens of retired U.S. generals and admirals. Many senators from both parties supported the release of that report, and his statement, in my view, was a direct attack on the patriotism of people who had a different view. The nominee said that the release of the report will ultimately cause Americans to be killed. Mr. President, the torture report was not some leak. The CIA engaged in what's called redaction, where they take out provisions that could put at risk Americans, took out names and pseudonyms, in some cases titles. So I asked the congressman whether he thought the agency had failed to protect Americans. He said he hadn't looked into it. In other words, he just asserted that the release of the report would cause Americans to be killed without having considered whether the CIA had adequately protected against that. When an intelligence program, such as the CIA's torture program, raises so many questions about our laws, our policies, and our fundamental values, the American people deserve to know about it. And when the President of the United States has repeatedly advocated for torture, it's especially critical that it be a public debate based on the facts. If that can be done while protecting sources and methods, openness is an imperative. That's why the congressman's statements about the release of the torture report are still so relevant. They call, in my view, into question his commitment to the principles of transparency and accountability when our country needs both. Finally, his responses to a number of other questions I proposed raised additional concerns about the lack of transparency. I asked him if he would commit to correcting inaccurate public statements. He said that wouldn't always be possible, and that it would be his bias to correct his own inaccurate statements. I don't think that's good enough. As we saw in the case of the public testimony by the Director of National Intelligence about surveillance, when the American people learned that intelligence officials have not been straight with them, it fundamentally erodes the trust between the public and the government, and that is not good for anyone. I also asked the congressman whether if a U.S. ambassador tells the CIA to cease activities in his or her country, the agency is obligated to comply. Despite a clear statute that establishes this authority, the nominee refused to answer. So this, in my view, raises questions about whether the CIA is going to maintain secret interpretations of the law. And without taking a lot of time, sources and methods have to be classified in secret, but the law ought to be public. And going back to secret laws we saw with the phone records program would be a big mistake. I'll wrap up by mentioning the Congressman's shifting views on the intelligence community's assessment with regard to Russia and the U.S. election.
Come up here because of things in their background that have no real rational reason for exploration as to whether they can sufficiently do the job, then America stands a chance of losing the best and the brightest, regardless of where they grow up, regardless of the color of their skin, regardless of the success of themselves or their family. So I say that to my colleagues in hopes that we will back off before we have done everlasting damage to our possibilities to get the right people here. Representative Pompeo has an honorable and energetic has honorably and energetically represented the people of the 4th District in Kansas for 3 terms. As I said, he's on the House Intelligence Committee. I can't think of a member of Congress, House or Senate, that has traveled more around the country, around the world, spent more time at the CIA understanding the ins and outs of what they do, of how they do it, of why it's important to the American people and to the security of this country than Mike Pompeo. He's well-versed on intelligence community operations and capabilities, their authorities. He understands the nature of the threat we face here at home and abroad. Some are going to question whether, in fact, his personal views that maybe there are events that happen that want to challenge Congress to change the laws are important or not. That's fine for him or me or for the president to question. The important thing is, how did he answer it if you applied it today? And his answer was, I would follow the law. I wouldn't circumvent the law. I would follow the law, and the law says this today. Short of Congress changing the law, I will follow the law as it is today. I'm not sure that you can have more clarity in an answer than that. Mike Pompeo is his intellectual rigor, his honorable service, his outstanding judgment makes him a natural fit for the CIA. As I said earlier, he's one of the most active, most engaged, and most charismatic individuals that I've seen nominated in quite a while. So, Mr. President, I ask my colleagues, support the nomination of Mike Pompeo as the next director of the CIA. Do it expeditiously. Treat him fairly. Don't paint him for something he's not. He is a colleague of ours that worked hard to be here, has a background of proof as to why the 4th District of Kansas made an incredibly wise decision. But more importantly, Mike Pompeo is somebody that can contribute in a significant way to the security of the American people, the security of this country, and can, in fact, manage and lead at the CIA without concerns as to whether there is the integrity of the institution, without concerns as to whether he might step across the legal line of what's appropriate. That every day there, he's there, in fact, following the rule of law in this country, and whose primary focus it is to make sure that we, as policymakers, the President as Commander-in-Chief, has the best intelligence possible to make decisions about America's future and about America's security. So I hope it won't take 6 hours today, but we're in the first hour of that, and I would urge my colleagues, be brief, but be thorough, but at the end of the day, make sure that the CIA tomorrow morning has permanent leadership and not acting leadership. And with that, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Louisiana.
Mr. President, I had the privilege today with Senator Collins to introduce a replacement bill for Obamacare. And if you will, it's been her experience as a insurance commissioner, mine as a physician caring for the uninsured and the underinsured. And let me also give due credit to Pete Sessions, who's over on the House side, who's introducing a very similar bill, to come up with something that we think works. And not just for people we represent, but for the entire country. And that is our goal. So I'd like to speak a little bit about the Patient Freedom Act of 2017. And our goal, if you will, I just tell my staff to imagine a woman who voted for Donald Trump, doesn't like Obamacare, but she's got breast cancer. And her coverage has a $6,000 deductible, but she has coverage. On the other hand, she wants to see something different. If we keep our efforts, if we just view our efforts through the prism of her care, then, Mr. President, I think we'll do right by the American people. And let me say something else. Our goal, again, is not to come up with a Republican plan. It is not to come up with an anti-Obamacare plan. Our goal is to come up with an American patient plan where whomever she is or he is, they can feel comfortable that we as a Senate are trying to do right by the American people. So let's go to first principles. First principles is we in the Republican Party think that if you like your insurance, you should be able to keep it. And I'll come to that later. President Obama got rightly criticized because he pledged that. Turns out it wasn't true. That's one of our first principles. We mean it. Secondly, we think that states should have the power, not the federal government. When you speak to Americans, they want their state capital to be the kind of principal force behind how their insurance is administered, not our nation's capital. So we return power to both the states and to patients. And lastly, I will say that we are truly reaching out to Democrats. One of the criticisms of Obamacare, it was rammed through on a partisan vote with hardly a consideration given of Republicans. Senator Collins and I are absolutely open to working with Democrats for this solution. So how do we begin? We first begin by repealing the Obamacare mandates and penalties. The American people do not like Washington telling them how to live their lives. So we take those mandates and penalties for both the individual and the employer, and we take them off. Secondly, we work to make health care truly affordable. We do this by giving states a choice to put in what we call the state alternative. I think we're going to begin calling it the better choice. And in the better choice, we would use tax credits that would go to those who are eligible, that would go into an account that would be, if the patient did nothing, she would have a health savings account which would be pre-funded. The money would go in, actually put money into the account, catastrophic coverage, and a pharmacy benefit. It's important to note that she would have the power over this account. If she wished, she could combine it with her family and these different tax credits, and they could buy a richer family policy. Or she could assign it to her employer as the employee's contribution for an employer-sponsored plan. If the family decided each of them to keep their own HSA account, and one of them got a terrible illness and they kind of went into the cash portion, they exhausted their health savings account, we would allow family members to donate their health savings account balance to each other to help cover that cash exposure. We do different things, but the goal is to give the patient the power. Now, we also, since we are going to these health savings accounts under the Better Choice model, that's okay, you can leave it here. In the Better Choice model, again, we give these tax credits that go into a health savings account. The individual can donate their own money or the employer can contribute theirs. Here's some of the options that they can do, but whichever option they have, we institute price transparency. That is to say that when the patient goes to have her blood test, she will know the cost of the blood test before she has it done, as opposed to finding out later. This came to mind this past Sunday. I had a friend in town who was in for the inauguration. She's a physician, and she went for a vitamin D level. When she goes for a vitamin D level, she gets the bill. It's $290. She calls up the hospital. She goes, I order these all the time. Am I really getting a $290 charge on each of these? Oh, yes, ma'am. That's what we bill patients. So she goes to different labs and she finds out what the cash price is for the panels of labs she typically orders. She has a patient come who's from out of town paying cash. And she says, pay me $38. It'll cover the labs. Here's the slip. Go to the lab. Patient pays $38, but goes to the wrong laboratory. She's from out of town, not quite sure where to go. She goes to the wrong laboratory. The bill she gets, which in one lab would be $38, in the other lab is $690. My physician friend calls the hospital, says, you got to be kidding, $690. They reduced it to $380. There is a tenfold difference in the cash price for labs. If the patient wanted known that, she probably would have paid more attention to the directions. But certainly if the labs were the price of the labs were posted when she went up, even if she went to the wrong place, she could have looked at the fee schedule and decided that she needed to go someplace else. One of my young men who works with me said, yeah, I get it, price transparency. Who would buy a car without knowing the price beforehand? It would be great for the car dealer, but really lousy for you. That's how we purchase health care now. It's great for the folks selling the service. It's pretty lousy for the person selling the cash, paying with cash. And by this, we think we begin to use market forces to reduce costs. By the way, this is not only about saving the patient money, which is very important, but there's also an example. John Fleming is a physician who until recently was a member of the House of Representatives. And he tells the story of how a woman who worked with him, their office went to health savings accounts, and she came up and she said, Dr. Fleming, I don't like these health savings accounts. Previously, I had a pharmacy benefit that paid for my inhaler, and now don't have the same pharmacy benefit. And he goes, well, and you're under their plan at least, the health savings account, you can use that to pay for your inhaler. And he walks away. 6 months later, she comes up to him, and he turns around as she walks away and says, oh, by the way, if you stop smoking, you wouldn't need an inhaler. And then he walks away. 6 months later, she comes up, Dr. Fleming, you were right. He goes, I'm sorry, what was I didn't remember the conversation. And he turns around, she goes, remember when you told me if I stopped smoking, I wouldn't need an inhaler? I stopped smoking, and I don't need an inhaler. So what this does, it activates the patient. It gets her or him engaged in their health care. And between that, not only do we protect the patient's pocketbook, but we also do something positive for their health care. Now, under our plan, can we go back to the one we had previously? Let me also point this out. We think most states will go for the better choice. It is possible, though, a state will reject everything. We don't want Medicaid expansion dollars. We don't want any extra help for those who are lower income, and we would give states that choice. This is not Washington, D.C. forcing something on people. Let me also point out something else. Republicans believe if you like your health care, you can keep it. Your health insurance, you can keep it, and we mean it. If a state decided they wished to stay in Obamacare, I think it's a terrible decision. But this legislation would allow a state to do so. I was so disappointed. I saw that the minority leader, Mr. Schumer, criticized our bill, said things that weren't true, fake news, if you will, and that we didn't cover pre-existing conditions. We do. That the deductibles and copays would be too high. That's not true. But what's striking is that he hasn't read our legislation yet. This is what's wrong with Washington, D.C. Here we have something which in good faith would allow New York to stay in Obamacare if the people of New York decided they wish to, but we can look at double and even triple-digit premium increases in other states, and without reading our bill, other states are going to be condemned to these double and triple-digit premium increases because folks don't want to consider something different. This is not a Republican plan. It is not a Democratic plan. We want it to be an American plan where states can decide the best system for their state, and if it's working for New York, they can stay in New York. It's not working for Louisiana, and so our state would go with the better choice, I'm confident. But that said, please don't criticize the plan before you even look at it. And please allow those in the Democratic side who are down to one insurance company on their exchanges with double-digit premium increases to at least consider an option that would be good for their state. Now, folks say, well, hey, you don't have a mandate. We don't think Washington, D.C. should be telling people how to live their lives. So how do we, under our better choice, get folks to get the kind of big insurance pool without a mandate? We give states the option to do what we call automatic enrollment. If someone is eligible, they would be enrolled. The tax credit they receive would be adequate for their premium. They would never have to put anything out of pocket to have this health savings account, high deductible health plan and pharmacy benefit that would be covered with the tax credit that they received. And by doing so, all these young males who haven't signed up for Obamacare because they're paying too much would actually be enrolled in an insurance plan. And now, for those who get ill or have chronic conditions, you're spreading the cost of their expensive illness over the many healthy and not just over the few sick. It restores the law of big numbers. We had an insurance plan model this, and they said they think just by doing our method of enrollment, it would lower premiums by 20%. That's without an individual mandate. By the way, think of the folks that will never sign up for an Obamacare exchange policy. The mentally ill person living beneath a bridge. He's not going to go to a public library. If he has a W-2 form, he doesn't know where it is, and sign up for a 16-page online form to sign up for Obamacare. Under our policy, he could be automatically enrolled. And so if he goes to the urgent care center with a cellulitis, he has coverage. If something terrible happens, he's hit by a car, goes to the emergency room and is admitted to the hospital, society is protected from major expenses. And if he gets his life together enough, he has a pharmacy benefit to provide him those antipsychotics. So we actually think we will increase the number who truly need health care, the number of those who are covered. Let me finish up by speaking about our timeline. We would hope over this next year that Republicans and Democrats can come together. I understand Democrats will not vote for a reconciliation bill that begins the repeal process of Obamacare, but that almost certainly will pass. What we would hope is that sometime within this year, Democrats who live in states with only one insurance company on their exchanges, in which premiums are increasing by double, maybe even at that time in their states, triple digits, would come together to vote with us to give their state an option for our better choice. So we would pass that legislation in 2017, giving their state legislatures and governors the option to choose this pathway in 2018. In 2019, the states would implement their option of choice, and by 2020, it's all been done. That is our hope. Folks say Senator Collins and I are naive, that the Senate cannot overcome its partisanship, that inevitably it'll be so partisan, people without reading bills will criticize our legislation, saying things about it which are not true. And I go back to where I started. That woman didn't go to college, working hard, voted for Trump, doesn't like Obamacare, but has breast cancer. She needs coverage, and she wants something done for her. We want to give her the power. We want to give her that coverage. And my goal is that when this finishes, as she goes from cancer to health, the only thing that she knows about her coverage is that decisions about her health care are made in her state capitol and around her kitchen table, and that as her breast cancer is treated, her health coverage improves. That's our goal. It is not a Democratic plan or Republican plan. It is not a partisan plan. It is a plan for her. That is our goal. And now I yield.
Madam President. The Senator from Maine.
Thank you, Madam President. First, let me commend the senator from Louisiana for his extraordinary work on this bill. It has been a great pleasure to work so closely with him as we have made a genuine effort to put together a bill that would be a reasonable replacement for Obamacare, that would help to bring people together. And I just want to commend him for his expertise. As a physician, Senator Cassidy brings an important perspective to this debate, particularly since he has practiced for so many years in hospitals in Louisiana that serve the uninsured. So I want to personally thank him for the privilege of working to craft this bill together. Madam President, there has been much debate recently on the best approach to replacing and reforming the Affordable Care Act. Considerable confusion and anxiety exists about the current status of the law and about the future of health care in our country. What is often overlooked in this discussion, however, is that while the ACA provides valuable assistance for some people who were previously uninsured, the system created by the law is under tremendous financial strain. Obamacare exchanges are on the verge of collapse in many states. The reality is that significant changes must be made. Doing nothing cannot be an option. I am therefore both surprised and disappointed by the remarks of the Democratic leader to the press and on the floor today about the genuine effort that Senator Cassidy and I have put forward in introducing the Patient Freedom Act. First of all, let me point out that the Democratic leader could not possibly have read our bill since we hadn't introduced it yet. And it is evident that he has misunderstood many of its provisions. For example, in a press statement, he said that we gutted the pre-existing condition protections that we strongly support and that are codified in our bill in Section 101B. That's Section 101B. It ensures that insurers cannot discriminate against individuals with pre-existing conditions who pay their premiums. I guess what disappoints me most, Madam President, is that the Democratic leader's response really represents what's wrong with Washington, D.C. The American people want us to come together. They want Democrats and Republicans to work as a team to solve the problems facing our nation. If we are going to have a leader on the other side of the aisle denounce to the press and come to the Senate floor to criticize a bill that has not even been introduced yet, where are we? I really hope that this is an aberration and that we can work together and that the compromises that we put in the bill are recognized as a good faith effort to bring both sides of the aisle together in the interests of the American people and in providing access to affordable health care. That's our goal. We're not saying our bill is perfect. We are open to refinements, but we have made a good faith effort. And to hear it described inaccurately and as other than a genuine effort to solve a problem truly disappoints me. The fact is the ACA has been in effect for years, yet nearly 30 million Americans still do not have health insurance coverage. Many of those who do not have coverage through the ACA, who do have coverage through the ACA exchanges, are experiencing large spikes in premiums, deductibles, and copays, increasing costs to consumers and taxpayers alike. Contrary to the predictions made by the early supporters of the ACA, premiums are increasing in nearly every state, with an average increase of 25% nationally. Now, in New York State, the average increase on the exchange is 16.6%. I don't know, perhaps the Democratic leader thinks that is an acceptable rate of increase. It strikes me as pretty high. And the situation, even though it's below the national average, is still in the double digits. The situation is even more dire in some states like Arizona, where premiums have increased by 116%. And in many counties throughout our country, there is only one or two health insurers offering plans on the exchanges, severely limiting consumer choice. In my state of Maine, premiums for the individual market for 2017 have soared by 22% on average, and plan options have become more limited. Now, subsidies do cushion the blow for those consumers who are eligible for them, but others have had to shoulder the full increase. And of course, taxpayers have borne a greater burden. Moreover, individuals and families with incomes exceeding 250% of the poverty rate are not shielded from the dramatic increases in deductibles and copays. That is important to remember. The premium subsidy goes up to incomes up to 400% of the poverty rate. It then, by the way, drops off the cliff, and you're eligible for no subsidy whatsoever. There's no orderly phase out. But for help with copays and deductibles under the Affordable Care Act, the threshold is 250% of the poverty rate. So these huge premium spikes and increases in deductibles and larger copays are having an effect on families and individuals who are by no means wealthy all over this nation. Many with coverage under the ACA are also facing increasingly narrow networks, which means that they may find that their preferred doctors are not in their networks. This can be particularly difficult for rural states that may have few specialists and whose citizens rely on major medical centers in nearby states. If patients want to continue to see these doctors, they can be faced with enormous costs that are not covered by their ACA insurance. As one Mainer put it, President Obama said, "I could keep my doctor," and the insurance company says, "I can't." The co-ops created under the ACA to help provide health insurance coverage have been failing at an alarming rate. In fact, only 5 of the 23 remain operational. It is also important to carefully consider the effects that Obamacare's Medicare cuts have had on providers like rural hospitals and home health agencies, many of whom are struggling. In some, Prices are skyrocketing, coverage is narrowing, and the individual market is likely in a death spiral if Congress fails to act. Madam President, I know that many members of this chamber share the goal of expanding access to affordable health care. Over the years, I've collaborated with colleagues on both sides of the aisle on a number of initiatives. And today, I'm pleased to join my colleague, Senator and Dr. Bill Cassidy, in introducing the Patient Freedom Act of 2017 to help ensure that Americans have access to affordable health care that improves choices and helps to restrain costs. Let me emphasize again that our bill is a work in progress. It is not perfect. However, what it does, and it's virtually unique in this regard, in this chamber, is it puts specific proposals on the table as we seek to craft bills to repair and improve the Affordable Care Act. Other legislation being discussed, such as those designed to help small businesses pool risks so that they can better afford to provide insurance to their employees, also deserve consideration. Let's get a lot of ideas on the table, but you have to start. And we have been willing to step forward and propose a specific bill, and to be criticized for that by the Democratic leader is just so disappointing, particularly since the leader is well aware that I work across the aisle all the time to try to find solutions for our country. The Patient Freedom Act is built on the premise that giving people more choices is superior to the one-size-fits-all approach that defined the Affordable Care Act. We recognize that what works best for the people in Maine or New Hampshire may not be right for the people in New York or California. Our bill respects those differences by giving states options to choose the path that works best for their citizens. Now, one of the options, Madam President, would allow a state to choose to continue operating insurance markets pursuant to all the rules of the Affordable Care Act. So if New York State wants to keep with the status quo, despite the 16.6% increase on average in the premiums for the individual market, New York State can make that choice. If a state chooses to remain covered by the ACA, exchange policies will continue to be eligible for cost-sharing subsidies and advanced premium tax credits, and the insurance markets will still be subject to ACA requirements. The individual mandate and the employer mandate will also remain in place for that state. Medicaid expansion states will continue to receive federal funding. So if a state's happy with the status quo, with spiraling costs, with limited choices, with a market that is broken, fine, keep the ACA. In some states, maybe it's working well. States should have that option, and they would under the Cassidy-Collins bill. More appealing to many states, however, would be what we call the better choice option in the Patient Freedom Act that would allow a state to waive many of the requirements of the ACA except for vital consumer protections and still receive federal funding to help its residents purchase affordable health insurance. Senator Cassidy has explained how it will work so I won't go through that all again. Let me just say that eligible individuals in states selecting this option would receive federal funding deposited into their Roth health savings accounts. The aggregate funding for these per beneficiary deposits would be determined based on the total amount of funding that the federal government would have provided in the form of ACA subsidies in each state, plus any funding each state would have received had it chosen to expand its Medicaid program, even if, like my state, it has chosen not to do so. And the deposits in the Roth health savings accounts will be phased out for higher income beneficiaries. So states selecting this option for every resident who does not have health insurance coverage through his or her employer or through public programs like Medicare or the VA or the federal health insurance, the Federal Employees Health Benefits Program. In those states, the option would be a standard health insurance plan that would include first dollar coverage through the health savings account, basic prescription drug coverage, and a high deductible health plan. States could automatically enroll their residents who are uninsured in this standard plan unless the individual opted to use his or her health savings account to purchase more comprehensive coverage or opted out of coverage altogether. I can't imagine someone making the choice of opting out altogether when they would receive this generous subsidy. In addition to federal funds, individuals and employers could make contributions to these health savings accounts, and the balances would grow tax-free. The bill also provides for a partial tax credit for very low-income individuals who do receive employer-based coverage to help these workers pay for their deductibles and their co-pays. Here's another important provision of our bill. Healthcare providers receiving payments from the Roth health savings accounts would be required to publish cash prices for their services. That would add transparency that is sorely lacking in our current system and that we need to move toward a more patient-directed healthcare future. So, for example, if you have been suggested to have a colonoscopy by your physician, you would know whether one hospital or one clinic would charge you more than another so that you could make the right decision for you. Healthcare reform should be about expanding affordable choices. And that is what our legislation aims to do by allowing states to structure their individual health insurance markets, and to do so without the burdensome individual mandate, the employer mandate, or many of the other restrictive requirements in the ACA that have substantially driven up costs and forced millions of Americans to buy coverage that is more than they want, need, or can afford. Americans should have the choice to purchase more affordable coverage if that is what works best for them. But let me again emphasize, since misinformation was given to the press about the consumer protections in our bill, the Patient Freedom Act would retain several important consumer protections, contrary to what was said earlier today by a colleague who hadn't read our bill. Dependents will be able to remain on their parents' health insurance policies until age 26. Insurance companies will still not be able to exclude coverage for pre-existing conditions or discriminate based on health status. In fact, there's no medical underwriting for the standard plan offered under the better option approach. Insurance companies cannot cap benefits by including lifetime or annual limits in their policies, and they must offer to renew policies as long as enrollees continue to pay premiums. Insurance companies must also continue to cover mental health and substance use disorder benefits for individuals, a particularly important benefit given the nationwide scope of the opioid crisis that has seriously affected my state of Maine and so many other states throughout our country, ruining the lives of individuals, their families, and their communities. Provisions like these vital consumer protections should be retained. However, the Washington-centric approach of the ACA must be changed if we are ever to truly reform our broken healthcare system. Madam President, I am pleased to see a growing consensus among members of both the Senate and the House that we must fix the Affordable Care Act and provide reforms at nearly the same time as we repeal the law. This will help protect the families who rely on the program and give insurers time to transition to a new marketplace that is based on more choices for consumers. That is what we are trying to do here. Reforms in the way we provide health insurance must ensure that individuals relying on the current system do not experience a needless and avoidable gap in coverage. If we are going to reform the system, we must begin to put specific proposals on the table for our colleagues to debate, refine, amend, and enact. And that's why the criticism is so disappointing. This is an attempt to put forth a possible solution that would appeal to members on both sides of the aisle. As we continue our work to find a responsible path to repealing and repairing the ACA, we should give the states the freedom to choose what they believe works best for their citizens, whether that means staying with the Affordable Care Act or selecting a different, in my view, a better path that will lead to patient-directed reforms that contain costs and provide more choice. The Patient Freedom Act does exactly that, and I commend my colleague, Senator Cassidy, for his leadership on this legislation, and I also want to thank our co-sponsors, including Senator Isaacson and Senator Capito, for their support as well. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President.
Senator from Vermont.
Madam President, I understand that the order was for the distinguished senior senator from Oregon to be recognized next. Is that correct? No. Well, Madam President, I see the distinguished Senator from Oregon on the floor, I would ask consent that I be recognized for 5 minutes and then yield to the Senator from Oregon.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Sometime tonight, the Senate's going to vote on the President's nominee to be the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, I said on Friday, as did several others, and led by the Senator from Oregon, I don't believe the Senate should rush to confirm such a critical position unless you've had real debate or discussion. We're having that debate today. So on Friday, I was able to support a motion to proceed to the nomination. Now, our intelligence agencies have an enormous task ahead. The challenges they face range from state-sponsored information warfare to countering violent extremists around the world. And of course, among those who are going to lead them is going to be the next director of the Central Intelligence Agency. The importance of the CIA actually can't be overstated. We need a director who's going to manage the agency with the full confidence of the American people. And the confidence is based not only on a future director's ability to understand security challenges, but his or her ability has to be there to safeguard the privacy, the civil liberties of all Americans, to uphold and advance United States leadership in protecting human rights. They are, after all, part of our country and part of our government. Now, I know President Trump issued some very, very strong condemnations of our intelligence agencies during the campaign. I think at one point even drew a Nazi analogy. I'm hoping that has changed. But I have serious concern with President Trump's nominee to lead the CIA. Congressman Pompeo has called for the reestablishment of the bulk collection of Americans' phone records. He's even argued, and this is chilling, he's argued that the intelligence community should combine that metadata with publicly available financial and lifestyle information into a comprehensive, searchable database. I want to say that legal and bureaucratic impediments to surveillance should be removed. He's talking about Americans, searching them. Can you imagine what somebody with a mindset, say, of J. Edgar Hoover would have done with something like that? And we worried about that, and Congress outright rejected the bulk collection of Americans' records when it passed the USA Freedom Act of 2015. Republicans and Democrats across the political spectrum joined together. And we did this with an overwhelming bipartisan basis. We rejected the very program, overwhelmingly, that Congressman Pompeo said he wants to bring back. Now, during his testimony last week, Congressman Pompeo attempted to diffuse this and other questions about his more alarming positions by affirming his appreciation of the supremacy of law. Well, Madam President, I've been here long enough to hear a lot of tried and true confirmation conversions. This sounds like one. I appreciate he testified that he understands the responsibility of a director to uphold the Constitution and the laws passed by Congress. What else is he going to say? But I remain deeply concerned that he's advocated for such dangerous measures in the first place, measures that we have overwhelmingly, Republicans and Democrats have overwhelmingly rejected. And I am concerned they'll push to remove, quote, legal and bureaucratic impediments to surveillance, close quote, just as he said last year. We should think about that. Our safety also includes our privacy. The Americans can think that we are not spied upon the way they do in countries like Russia. We don't want to be another Russia. We don't want to be spied on. We face great threats from around the world. We face them from Russia, from ISIS, and other adversaries. The director of the CIA has to be trusted by all Americans to protect us from threats from countries like Russia and others, but at the same time protect our core values, which make us different. Now, I don't question Congressman Pompeo's loyalty to our nation. I'm sure he's a very loyal American. But I do question his stated beliefs that immediate security concerns can be used as a justification for eroding and taking away the fundamental rights of all Americans. For those reasons, I cannot support his nomination. And I thank the distinguished senior senator from Oregon for letting me take this time.
Madam President,
Senator from Oregon.
before he leaves the floor, I just want to thank Senator Leahy, particularly because once again on this issue, he showed that there was a path forward that was bipartisan. The senior senator from Vermont got together with our colleague from Utah, Senator Lee, and the two of them set out from the get-go to try to find common ground. I think most people didn't give us great odds. Senator Leahy and I used to talk about how when we began the effort, being on the Intelligence Committee and the Judiciary Committee, a group of us could probably have met in a phone booth. But then we began to pick up, under Senator Leahy's leadership, colleagues from both sides of the aisle. The Obama administration, which we both remember had reservations at the beginning, said, look, we can find a way, as the intelligence community said, to go forward with this. But this didn't happen by osmosis. It happened under the leadership of Senator Leahy and Senator Lee, our colleague on the other side of the aisle. And one of the reasons that we feel so strongly, as the senator from Vermont has stated, is that if we're not careful, particularly with this nomination, we could unravel a lot of that good and bipartisan work. So I know my colleague's got a tight schedule, and I so appreciate him coming over and very much recognize that one of the reasons we're here is to make sure we don't undo the good bipartisan work that he has authored. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that Eric Skidmore, Kaylee Farrell, Benjamin Willis, Kelly Singleton, and Catherine Hockey, legislative fellows in my office, be given floor privileges for the rest of this Congress.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Madam President, today the Senate is doing something that doesn't happen often around here, having an open debate about the future of the Central Intelligence Agency. The Central Intelligence Agency, in my view, is an enormously important and valuable part of our government. It is staffed by thousands and thousands of patriotic Americans who make extraordinary sacrifices on our behalf. They work so hard to protect our country in so many ways Americans will never find out about. They give up their time. They give up their weekends and family vacations and all kinds of things that would be scheduled that they would enjoy personally, and they give it up on an hour or two's worth of notice because they want to protect the security and the well-being of our nation. The fact is, many at the CIA have risked their lives defending us, and some have made the ultimate sacrifice with their lives. Now, when you talk about the CIA on the Senate floor, it's especially important to protect the people I've just mentioned and to protect what are called their sources and methods. Sources and methods are the secret means by which the CIA gets the information that's needed for our national security, and it needs to stay classified. But while sources and methods need to stay classified, the debate about our laws and those who execute them, that's a public matter. The policies that guide what the CIA does in its important work, the debate about policies has always got to be public. And the nomination of a CIA director is a rare and important chance to talk about what the nominee thinks those policies ought to be. Now, in beginning, Madam President, I'm going to offer my guiding principle. Smart national security policies protect both our security and our liberty. And they recognize that security and liberty is not mutually exclusive, that it's possible to have both, that it's essential to have both. And nothing illustrates the need for policies that promote security and liberty more clearly than the issue of encryption, which we will be talking about, in my view, at length in this Congress as part of the intelligence debate. Strong encryption protects Americans from foreign hackers, criminals, identity thieves, stalkers, and other bad actors. It's the key to protecting our cybersecurity. Yet there are some in government and some in the Congress who think that it would make sense to require American companies to build back doors into their products so that the government could get access to that information. My own view is this would be an enormous mistake. A mistake from a security standpoint, a mistake from a liberty standpoint, and also very damaging to our companies, companies that produce jobs with good wages. And I've been fighting against ill-advised encryption proposals because they would be bad for security, for the reason I mentioned, be a big gift to foreign hackers, bad for liberty. And the reality is, if we require our companies to build back doors into their products, the first thing that's going to happen is all the companies overseas where they won't have such rules will benefit enormously. And a lot of good-paying jobs, high-skill, high-wage jobs, would be at risk. So I bring this up only by way of stressing how important it is that we get this right, that we advance policies that promote security and liberty, and we recognize right at the get-go that they are not mutually exclusive. So with that in mind, we turn to the nomination of Congressman Mike Pompeo to be the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. After consideration of his testimony and a review of his past statements and response to written questions, I have concluded that he is the wrong man for the job. He has endorsed extreme policies that would fundamentally erode the liberties and freedoms of our people without making us safer. He has been unwilling to provide meaningful responses to my questions with respect to these views. And when he has provided responses, they have often either been so vague or so contradictory that it is impossible to determine what his core beliefs are or what he might actually do if he is confirmed. On issue after issue, the congressman has taken 2, 3, or 4 positions, depending on when he says it and who he is talking to. He has done this with surveillance, with torture, with Russia, and a number of other subjects. So now we are at the end of the confirmation process. There has been a hearing. I met with the nominee in private. We submitted 2 sets of questions, both before and after the hearing. And despite it all, it has been impossible to walk away with consistent answers on the congressman's beliefs on how he would lead the Central Intelligence Agency. Let me begin with surveillance. Just over a year ago, Madam President, after the USA Freedom Act had become law, Congressman Pompeo wrote in an op-ed that Congress should pass a law reestablishing collection of all metadata. This was a reference to the program in which the government collected and kept the records of tens of millions of innocent Americans. When the American people found out about this program, they were rightly horrified and they rejected it, which was why, as we've touched on this afternoon on a bipartisan basis, Congress abolished the program through the USA Freedom Act. That law got the government out of the business of collecting these millions of phone records on law-abiding people, and it did nothing to harm our security. For example, I'm very proud that I was able to work in a bipartisan way to author a provision that allowed the government in emergency circumstances to get phone records immediately and then go back later and seek court approval. So I wrote that provision, Madam President, to make sure that when the security of our great nation was on the line, it would be possible for our national security officials to move immediately, without delay, to get the information that was needed. Congressman Pompeo himself voted for the USA Freedom Act before he turned around 8 months later and wrote that he wanted to reestablish this sweeping and unnecessary program. So understand the timeline. The congressman talks about voting for the USA Freedom Act, but after he cast that vote, he came out in a widely circulated article in the Wall Street Journal for a proposal that really makes all the earlier collection of phone records about law-abiding people look like small potatoes. And I'm going to discuss that this afternoon. So the question really is, what does the congressman believe? Does he stand by his vote to abolish the NSA phone records dragnet? Was that what he was suggesting when he brought up that vote during his hearing? Or does he stand by what he wrote in his major opinion article that came out well after the law that he voted for? In response to questions, the congressman wrote that he believes that the collection of tens of millions of Americans' phone records provided a significant tool for the Intelligence Committee and that he, quote, "I have not changed my position." Now, Madam President, that sounds like an endorsement of the mass surveillance of phone records. Again, in the hearing, the nominee said something else. Senator Heinrich asked him, whether he had been briefed on whether the current process, where the government collects phone records on an individual basis rather than in bulk from millions of Americans, even if they're not suspected of a crime, and whether the current process protects our nation as well as the liberty of the millions of innocent Americans. Now, the congressman's a member of the House Intelligence Committee, so he has had the opportunity to be briefed on this topic. But here's his response to Senator Heinrich. I'll quote here, "Senator, I have not had a chance to have a complete briefing on that, but I can say I've not heard anything that suggests that there is a need for change today." In other words, in just a matter of days, Congressman Pompeo has taken the position, first, that the bulk collection of American phone records was a significant tool and that it should be reestablished, and second, while testifying to the committee, that he has no basis on which to believe that is necessary. That is such a head-scratcher, Madam President. I just don't know how to go about squaring these truly conflicting statements. What troubles me especially is if the congressman were to be confirmed as CIA director, the doors would close and he would operate in secret. And yet Americans do not know which position he would take in running the CIA. The American people have no idea how Congressman Pompeo would advise the president and his national security team on what is truly necessary to protect the nation. Phone records are not the only communication records we need to be concerned about. Until a few years ago, the NSA also ran a program in which millions of Americans' email records were collected. Since the congressman wrote that he wanted to reestablish collecting all of the metadata, I asked him whether he would support the resumption of that program as well, and whether he believed that millions of Americans' email records should be combined with millions of American phone records. He could have said no. He could have clarified that he was only talking about phone records. Instead, he ducked taking a position. In fact, he even indicated that he would be open to including email records in his new database. His exact words were, "If I am confirmed and agency officials inform me that they believe the current programs and legal framework are insufficient to protect the country, I would make appropriate recommendations for any needed changes to laws and regulations." Now, what's especially troubling about this is that the bulk email program was discontinued because it wasn't effective. I spent a lot of time pressing intelligence officials to give us some evidence that you had to go out and collect all of these email records from law-abiding Americans. In the end, the agency decided to look at it, and they came to the same conclusion I did, that it wasn't needed. That's not a judgment about whether the program violated Americans' privacy, because it definitely did that. The NSA determined that, in its words, not mine, the program did not meet their operational expectations. This is public information. And of course, all the details are available to the House Intelligence Committee on which the congressman sits. This should have been an easy answer for the nominee, but he refused to rule out the inclusion of millions of Americans' email records, records the NSA has said it doesn't need in what would be his idea of a massive new government database. But the collection of phone and email records of millions of innocent Americans is small potatoes compared to what the nominee wrote next. His proposal was to combine all of the communications metadata, and these are his words, with publicly available financial and lifestyle information into a comprehensive searchable database. Madam President, this is far bigger and more encompassing than any such data collection program that the Bush-Cheney administration ever imagined. I've been a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee since before 9/11. I've been in a lot of debates about the appropriate scope of government surveillance. I have never heard, ever, not from anyone, an idea so extreme, so overarching, and so intrusive of Americans' privacy. And I wanted to give the congressman the opportunity to explain what he was actually proposing. So during the confirmation hearing and later in what are questions that are submitted to him, I tried to find out what his database would include and what, if anything, it wouldn't include. I could not get substantive answers. What we basically got was a big word salad with a liberal helping of words that just kind of skirted the issue. My folks would call them weasel words. The congressman did mention social media in his answers, but it's one thing for the government to read the social media postings of an American because there is a specific reason to do so. It is something else entirely to create a giant government database of everyone's social media postings and to match that up with everyone's phone records. We asked, where would the nominee draw the line? He wouldn't say. Congressman Pompeo's vision of this vast government database doesn't stop, by the way, with social media. What he wrote in his responses to my questions was that he was generally referring to publicly available information on the internet or other public databases. So I'll repeat that. He was generally talking about information in the public domain. So that raised the question of what else the nominee wanted to enter into a giant government database of information on millions of innocent Americans. For example, did he have in mind information on Americans that the government could obtain or purchase from third parties, such as data brokers who collect information on the purchasing history of our people? Imagine putting every American's purchases into a government database, along with their social media postings and all of their phone records. After 2 rounds of submitted questions and a hearing, it was not clear what the congressman meant when he referred to all metadata, how he defines publicly available financial and lifestyle information. What we know for sure is he wouldn't give us any real sense of what he wanted to do with this proposal. He just was unwilling to talk about it. Now, the responses I got from the congressman on this and other topics generally fell into 3 categories. The first was, I'll do what's legal. The second one was, when it comes to Americans' privacy, that's the FBI's problem, not the CIA's. And third, as CIA director, I won't do policy. I'm going to briefly state, Mr. President, why these are unacceptable answers. First, I asked the congressman if there were any boundaries to his proposed new vast database on Americans. His response was, of course there are boundaries. Any collection and retention must be conducted in accordance with the Constitution, statutes, and applicable presidential directives. That's just not a response, Mr. President. Just because the government may be able to legally obtain information on Americans on an individualized or limited basis doesn't necessarily make it legal, much less appropriate to create this vast database with all kinds of information on law-abiding Americans. And if you take his response to mean that the only boundaries are those established by law, then it's worth considering how the intelligence community has frequently interpreted the legal, let me say, limits in which it operates, flexibly and in secret. Even if you imagine that there are established legal boundaries that would rein in the congressman's CIA, consider what he himself has said about those legal boundaries. He wrote in his op-ed, and these are his words, Mr. President, not mine, legal and bureaucratic impediments to surveillance should be removed. It is also significant that throughout his response to questions, he refers to CIA policies, procedures, and regulations. As CIA director, he would be in a position to change those. Seems to me that the congressman can't have it both ways. He can't say he's bound only by legal restrictions and avoid saying what he thinks those restrictions should be. The nominee's second way to avoid answering the questions was by arguing that concerns about the privacy of Americans are the business of the FBI, not the CIA. That is just not the case. There is a long and unfortunate history related to the CIA and domestic intelligence, which the Church Committee documented in the 1970s. I'll be clear, I don't believe the CIA is up to anything like this today, but the possibility of returning to those days is certainly a possibility if the director of the CIA takes a flexible approach to the rules that are intended to keep the CIA out of the lives of American citizens. And I'll give just a few examples. On January 3rd, the Director of National Intelligence put out new procedures about the distribution within the Intelligence Committee of what is called raw signals intelligence. These are the actual content of communications as opposed to an analyst's report about these communications. According to the new procedures, these communications can be provided to the CIA if the CIA director asks for them and explains to the NSA why they need them. Here's why this matters to the privacy of Americans. When raw communications are distributed to the CIA, they include the communications of Americans that have been sucked up in the overall collection. So at this point, the CIA would have these communications. According to the new procedures, in some instances, the director of the CIA can approve CIA searches of that data for the communications of Americans. The director of the CIA can also approve the use of Americans' communications. So the question is, how would the congressman exercise these authorities? We just don't know. Another example would be the CIA's own procedures for dealing with information on Americans. Last week, the CIA updated these procedures in a 41-page public document. They cover, for example, the CIA's collection of vast amounts of information that include the communications of or information about Americans. What can be collected by the CIA, what can be kept by the CIA, what can be distributed by the CIA. The new procedures also cover when CIA officers are required